Hi, I am River Lightbearer from River Evolutions, channeling, consulting, and coaching, and healing, and all the other things that I do in my business. Wow, I really need to rehearse how I say that name because I always mess it up when I do these videos. Anyway, a couple of weeks ago, I did a video where I talked a little bit about the fact that trauma can change how your brain works, and that can impact how a trauma survivor is able, and whether a trauma survivor is able to access services like coaching and energy healing and other types of practices. And I wanted to follow up a little bit with that. Um, and I said I was going to talk this week about some quick and easy modifications that you might be able to make in your practice if you know that you're working with trauma survivors. Um, but before I get to that, I want to be really clear because I saw something on Facebook that kind of set me on edge. And the basic gist of it was that a trauma survivor is the only one who's responsible for whatever happens with them because of the trauma, and nobody else, and a survivor shouldn't expect anybody else to change or do anything to help them. Now that might not have been the intention of the post that I saw, but that was how it came across. And so I wanted to address that because um, personal responsibility is important, absolutely. And ultimately, a trauma survivor is responsible for getting therapy, learning how to manage their trauma responses, learning how to function in the world, even with the changes that the trauma may have caused in how their brain works. But that doesn't mean that they don't have the right to ask for help and support. If I say, okay, perfect example, or an example anyway, my husband used to call me silly, and he meant it as affectionate. He meant it, he was saying it, he thought, in a loving, affectionate way. But because of how I had been treated and invalidated by abusers in my life, that's a word that I cannot tolerate being called, because to me it is invalidating, and it also reminds me of the abusers who called me that. So I told my husband, when you call me silly, it feels very hurtful to me because of my trauma history. It's something my abusers called me, and it borderline triggers me because of that history. Would you please stop calling me that? And he said, thank you for telling me. Of course I'll stop calling you that. And he did. That wasn't a huge change I was asking him to make. And I'm not asking, and I'm not telling everybody in the world not to use the word silly around me. Like, that would be unreasonable. But asking somebody with whom I have a close relationship to stop calling me a particular word is not unreasonable. It is my responsibility to manage my reactions, but it is also my responsibility to advocate for myself and my needs. And I believe if you are the loved one, if you are a friend, if you are a professional who is being paid to work with this person, I believe that you do have some responsibility to help them if they say to you, would you mind changing this thing? Now, you can always say no, but that doesn't mean they don't have the right to ask. And I was not making my husband responsible for my reactions by saying, please stop using this word. I was taking responsibility for my reactions and realizing that this was something that was a little bit beyond my ability to manage, coming from this specific person. And so to me saying, please stop calling me that, was me taking responsibility, because I have a responsibility to myself to structure my life in a way that helps me feel safe and that allows me to function. So I wanted to address that because, if you're a practitioner who works with a trauma survivor and they say to you, I've realized that having you put your hands on my shoulders when we're talking is triggering for me. Would you please not do that? If you say to them, no, I'm going to keep doing it, I don't care if it triggers you, that's your responsibility, then you're not helping them in the slightest. And honestly, I can't conceive of somebody in a healing profession or coaching or anything that's supposed to be serving others. I can't conceive of anybody actually saying that, and yet I know it happens because it's happened to me. If you're in a practice where you are trying to serve others and help them heal and help them progress, but you're telling them that they have to deal with whatever you feel like doing and manage their own reactions because how they make you feel or how you make them feel isn't your responsibility, then I would question working with you personally. And if you feel called out by me saying that, then I am responsible for the impact that my words have. But in this case, if you feel called out by me saying that you are causing harm by telling people that you're not responsible for how you make them feel, it might be worth examining how you talk with and treat your clients. That's my suggestion, and if you have an issue with that, you are welcome to leave a comment, and as long as you are not too hateful and threatening and demeaning, I will leave your comment and I will respond respectfully. But if you work with trauma survivors, and it's a pretty safe bet that if you are in a practice like coaching, healing, anything like that, you almost certainly have clients who are trauma survivors, because a lot of us are drawn to that type of practice because we are trying to learn to manage, we are trying to learn new ways of functioning, we are trying to heal. And so a lot of us are drawn to that, and you might not know that you have trauma survivors in your client roster, but it's a reasonably safe assumption that you do. If somebody comes to you and tells you that they're a trauma survivor and says, I'm a trauma survivor, this thing that you have your clients do is triggering for me, can we find another way of doing it? You don't have to say yes. It's your practice. You can structure it however you want. But I'd like you to bear in mind that if a survivor says, can we modify this so that I can do it? If you they're not asking you to be responsible for their thing. It's the same thing as if somebody in a wheelchair came into your office and said, would you mind moving that chair so that I can actually get my chair into your office? They're not making you responsible for the fact that they're in a wheelchair. They're just asking for a slight change in how you have things set up so that they can get in. And it's the same thing if a trauma survivor asks for a modification. They're not trying to make you responsible for them. They're saying, I have this thing that affects how I can function in this environment. Can we change this thing so that I can function here? And the trauma responses, flashbacks, being triggered, any of that is not any more within the control of the trauma survivor than not being able to walk is within the control of somebody who's paralyzed. Trauma responses are not a choice. Being triggered is not a choice. It is a direct result of the changes that trauma causes in the structure and functioning of the brain. And when somebody's triggered, I want to explain triggers a little bit because a lot of people misunderstand that. When somebody is triggered in the actual definition of it, mental health wise, they have experienced a stimulating incident that is causing their brain to respond exactly as it responded at the time of the initial trauma, because the parts of the brain that are impacted don't recognize time. If something reminds you of the trauma, your brain perceives that as this event is happening now, as opposed to being able to recognize that this event happened 20 years ago. Because it's not the conscious mind. Recognizing the passage of time is a function of the conscious mind. But the part that's responding to the trauma and the trigger isn't the conscious mind, and it's not a part that responds to rational thinking. So when somebody's triggered, it's exactly as if they are experiencing the trauma all over again, because the part of their brain that's responding isn't realizing that the trauma's 10, 20, 30 years in the past. So some really basic ways of helping a trauma survivor to access your services is to ask them what they need. Like, that's the simplest way. When I have an energy healing client, for example, and I know that they have a trauma history, which I will know because when I take on a new client, one of the first things I ask them is, do you have a trauma history? They can choose to answer me or not, but I tell them I'm asking because I want this to be a beneficial experience for you, and there are some changes I can make depending on your needs if you are a trauma survivor. And that's not me taking responsibility for their trauma or for how it impacts them. That's me saying, I understand that trauma might impact you in certain ways, and I want this to be a positive experience for you, not a traumatic one. So I ask new clients, do you have a trauma history? If they say yes, if they're coming to me for an energy healing session in person, which hasn't happened in a very long time, but will hopefully be happening again soon, I will say to them, are you comfortable having me put my hands on you? Because that's part of the healing modality I practice. But the healing modality, and when I'm doing an in-person session, involves me putting my hands on them. However, it can be modified so that I have my hands slightly above them and not actually in contact with them. For some trauma survivors, that's preferable. Some trauma survivors can't even tolerate that, and in that case, I recommend that they have a distance session where they're not even in the same room with me, because then they don't have to worry about me standing too close. For some survivors, having somebody standing really close to them feels very frightening and threatening. If you are somebody who does yoga instruction, I speak from personal experience in this, yoga can be really, really difficult for trauma survivors because depending on the nature of the trauma, some of us have learned not to be in our bodies. And you have to be in your body if you are doing yoga asana, the poses. And also if you are taking a yoga class in person, sometimes the instructor physically manipulates you into the pose if you're not quite there. So if you're a yoga instructor, it's beneficial to your students and you to keep in mind that that a trauma survivor might not really have a full sense of their body, and they might not be able to tell if they're fully in the pose, but they also might not be able to tolerate you putting your hands on them to help them get into the pose. So ask them before you touch them. I think asking anybody before you touch them is best practice, personally. Whether you ask them each time or say at the beginning of the class, you know, when we're doing the poses, I might touch you. If you are not comfortable being touched, tell me now, or whatever. But that's a quick and easy modification to make for a yoga practice. Remember that they might have difficulty getting into the poses, and remember that it might not be a good idea to touch them without checking with them first. If you teach meditation or offer guided meditations or anything like that, a trauma survivor, if you're doing it face to face and there's a group of people, for some trauma survivors, having their eyes closed in a group of people is absolutely terrifying and triggering, because they can't see what's happening and they're around a group of people. And for some of us, being in a group of people feels borderline threatening to begin with, but then if we can't see it, it feels really scary. Managing that fear is the responsibility of the survivor, but can you have them do a meditation where they are looking at an object instead of closing their eyes? Is that a modification that you can make for a survivor? Can you allow them to go, if it's a meditation where they don't have to be in the room to hear you, can you allow them to go into an adjacent room where they're alone so they can close their eyes without having the fear of being around other people with their eyes closed? But ultimately, I believe that the best practice is to ask them what they need. If somebody says to you, I'm a trauma survivor, I'm concerned about taking your yoga class, ask them, what are you concerned about and how can I help you? What do you need from me to be able to do this class? And listen to what they say and believe what they say. If it sounds unreasonable to you, you can say, no, I'm not willing to do that. That's fine. But listen to them, believe them, and even if you're not willing to do it, validate that they have asked. Because for some of us who have been through long-term extensive trauma, just asking for what we need is a really scary thing. And it takes a lot of courage for some of us to be able to say, I need to keep my eyes open during the meditation time, or I need you to not touch me even if I'm not in the yoga pose correctly. Or I need you to play music during my healing session so that I'm not hearing people approaching me that aren't there, or whatever the case may be. It takes a lot of courage to be able to ask. And if somebody who is a trauma survivor is met with skepticism or blame, or is shamed for asking and for not being responsible for their own reactions, they're less likely to reach out for help again. They're not necessarily likely to have any services from you, but they may be less likely to reach out for other services that would benefit them, because it can be a cumulative effect for some of us. Each time we're shamed for having certain needs, each time we're accused of just wanting to not be well, or accused of just holding on to the past, it has a cumulative effect and it causes further harm. And I said in the previous video, and I think I might have said it earlier in this one, memory issues are part of trauma for me. Sorry. you don't have to change anything in your practice if you're not willing to. But if you're not willing to, and a trauma survivor comes to you and says, I have a trauma history, I need certain modifications, be upfront with them about your unwillingness so that they know what they're getting into if they choose to work with you, or they can make an informed choice about whether to work with you. You know, don't tell them, oh, that's fine, I'll work with you, and then invalidate them and refuse to help them access your services. And I know that in the last video and in this one, I am coming across as a little bit belligerent in a couple of moments, and I do apologize for that. This is a really it's a strong topic for me because I am a trauma survivor. I have been blamed and shamed for reactions and ways of functioning that are beyond my control. And I have spent years, because of that invalidation, believing that I was irreparably screwed up and that everybody was right and I just didn't want to be better. I was too lazy to do the work. And none of that was true. That was before I did the research and the studies and realized that trauma isn't just thought. Trauma isn't something you can control. It is a change in how your brain, mind, body, and energy work. And so I encourage practitioners and survivors to remember that. You can learn to manage the reactions. You can learn ways of functioning that are not impacted. It's not like a permanent hopeless state. But the way that you react until you learn to manage it is not within your control. The things that your mind and your brain and your body do because of the trauma are not within your control any more than a diabetic's blood sugar being out of whack is a choice on their part. They can manage their blood sugar by medication, diet, etc. But the fact that their blood sugar goes out of whack is not they're not choosing to have it out of whack, and they don't control it, they manage it. I don't control having flashbacks. That's not a choice that I make, because believe me, I would not choose to have flashbacks if I had a choice. It's a function of how my brain has been rewired by the trauma I experienced. So I encourage people to remember trauma causes long-lasting, sometimes permanent but not always, effects that are not a choice and are not within the control of the person. Having those changes is not within the control. Learning to manage them is. And if you are a practitioner, I encourage you to consider ways that you might change how you present your service to be more accessible to survivors in general. And I strongly encourage you, if a survivor comes to you and says, would you be willing to modify this in this way? I strongly encourage you to be open to the idea. Even if you decide you're not willing to, at least be open to that and validate them asking. And if you are a trauma survivor and you know that you need things a certain way to be successful, you know that certain things trigger you, you know how you need to do things to manage your reactions, I really encourage you to speak up for yourself, because you do have the right to feel safe in whatever practice you are receiving, whatever service you are receiving. You have the right to feel safe. You have the right to be validated. Your experiences and your needs are valid. You are valid. And so I encourage you to speak up if you're able to do so. And I encourage you to remember that you are not irreparably screwed up. You are not choosing to have these effects. And if a practitioner refuses to make the modifications you ask for, you don't have to work with them. But it's not personal against their refusal, isn't personal against you. It's might be lack of understanding, it might be that the modification isn't possible, but it's nothing personal against you, and it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you for asking. So that's it for this video. If you have questions, if you have thoughts, leave a comment below. I will respond as long as you are reasonably respectful. If you are belligerent, threatening, not belligerent because I was belligerent, but if you are threatening or there are certain types of comments, hateful, whatever, that I will delete. But if you are respectful, I will leave your comment and I will respond respectfully. I offer consultation services for coaches and practitioners who want some guidance on making their specific practice more trauma sensitive. I want to be clear, I am not a licensed professional. The consultation that I offer is based on my experiences as a trauma survivor and on a lot of research and studying that I have done on trauma effects, and trauma sensitivity. So I'm not a professional, but this is something I have a lot of knowledge about, and I'm really good at looking at things and seeing how can we tweak this, and explaining why it can be tweaked and how it can be tweaked. So if that's something that you're interested in, again, leave a comment and I will contact you. And yeah. And if you're interested in more videos about trauma sensitivity, about channeling, about energy healing, any of that kind of stuff, subscribe to the channel. I post videos every other week, usually, except when I forget to record them because memory issues are one of the trauma effects, as I may have said, except I forgot that I said it until I just said it again. Wow. It's time for me to end this video. I'll be back in a couple of weeks. Meanwhile, take care.